Hey, Kurt, can you hear us?
I hear you. Hey, how's it going?
Sorry about that. We got locked out of the REI room, and so we're just getting set up. So anyone on the call already, we might run a little late, but we'll do our best setup here. Getting the camera going here in a second. So
Okay. Yeah, I got it all set up. Yeah, I'll be here if you need help.
we'll be muted until we're a little closer to being ready to go, and then we'll
Okay.
update you.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks.
Okay, sorry everybody on the line. We had a couple technical difficulties stack on top of each other, but we're finally up and running. 5 minutes late, but you know, that's the way of the world now. So. I'd like to apologize that we moved the date on everybody. I know we're usually the week before, but we just had some fallouts of people presenting and stuff. So Tim has offered to fill in the gaps for us, which is great. So we'd really like to thank Tim. Before I hand it off, I just also want to remind everybody that you should have gotten an election notice today, hopefully. So please do participate in the election. And we are in the process of planning the winter soiree, so keep an eye out for that. I think we did send something out. Did we send something out about the winter soiree yet? Not yet. Okay, keep an eye out for that. That will be a little bit later in December, so hope to see many of you there. I think that's all the housekeeping items we have. So, you ready, Tim?
I'm ready.
Awesome.
I don't think I need a microphone in here. You guys are the backbenchers, so if you can't hear me, you gotta raise your hands. And they can hear me online, okay? Should we check that?
Can some, maybe Ted or Kurt let us know that you guys can hear us?
Yep, all good. Go ahead.
Okay, great. Fantastic. Well, good afternoon. Thank you for either signing on or attending in person. As Rebecca mentioned, this is kind of a, I won't say last minute, but we were at the Water Resources Conference and Keller and Rebecca said, or actually Ted was there too, and asked, we had somebody drop out. Do you have something you could cover, a topic for the next forum? And I am in the process of developing a wetland banking course for the Wetland Training Institute. So this is a good opportunity for us to kind of get this out there and get some feedback and assess interest from folks about the course and address some of these things. So my angle today is going to be with what we're trying to do with the course for the Wetland Training Institute, is geared towards what we call practitioners, or it's the people developing the banks and engaging the process and how to work through that from that side of the program instead of the agency staff telling you what they want and how to navigate it that way. Because they certainly have a perspective and there's nothing wrong with their perspective, but we think there's a need for the folks who are doing the work and engaging the process to really understand how can you work your way through this. So it'll be interesting if you afterwards have any feedback on it, please let me know. But we're going to focus today on the first two parts of the review process. If I can figure out how to move the slides. There we go. So you're probably all familiar with that graphic. The agencies use it quite frequently. It's the federal mitigation rule timeline there on the right with the timeframes involved. I'll just go over that real quickly because for those of you who don't frequently engage in wetland banking, this could be a lot of detailed information thrown at you in a very short amount of time. So, and I'm going to focus almost exclusively on the federal process. I'll do some translation to WACA and their process, but for the most part, Minnesota, these two things have merged in terms of the review process. There are some differences, which I'll point out at times, but for the most part, the time frames and the process is really driven by the federal mitigation rule because it is more restrictive. It has more limitations and standards and time frames and things that go on in the review process than does the one. So phase one, the draft prospectus under the federal mitigation rule is the only optional phase. So you do not have to do a draft prospectus if you do not want to. We'll talk more about that decision a little bit in a little bit. Phase in the draft prospectus phase is 30 days from start to finish. There's no completeness determination. I think it's making a little noise. I think it's okay, but I'm sorry. Rebecca's going to check it out. I'm going to keep going. You just flag me if we have a problem. Like I said, 30 days. There's no completeness determination. So you submit draft prospectus, engage the review process. It's almost like feedback.
I wonder if someone's not muted.
Oh, is that what it is?
Can everybody make sure to mute virtually? I see a couple people that are unmuted actually, so double check that right now.
Might be Joel. Sorry, Joel. Okay, so moving on, again, it's a 30-day process. There's no completeness determination from the time you submit it to the time you get feedback. It's supposed to be 30 days. I now have a cohort of this meeting, it says. So moving on from the draft prospectus to the prospectus, this is the first required step under the federal mitigation rules, so you must engage in this step. And under WACA, this is still an optional step. So most people, though, are engaging both programs at the prospectus phase and thereafter. So the prospectus phase, ideally 90 days. That does not include the time that the Corps would spend initially making a completeness determination for your prospectus. What is the time frame on that? There isn't one. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. But from the time that you have a complete prospectus until that phase is complete, which is when the Corps issues the initial evaluation letter, is supposed to be 90 days by rule. That includes a 30-day public comment period on your prospectus. So a lot squeezed into that time. And again, we'll go over more of the detail of that. After that, the third phase is the draft instrument phase, where you have a draft of the instrument, which is essentially the agreement between the bank sponsor and the Corps with engineers or other federal agencies that may sign on to that, and also your mitigation plan. So the equivalent under WACA at that phase is it used to be called the full bank plan or full plan. They've essentially become the same document. That bank plan is the mitigation plan. And that is the required step under WACA. So the first and only required step under WACA is the submission of the bank plan, which basically has been merged into the MBI phase. So that process, again, 90-day review. There's no public notice for that. It is exclusively an IRT or interagency review team review process to go over your draft version of the instrument and the plan. After that, you get what's called status update letter, which contains the items that you must address if you're going to submit the final instrument. If you then go on to the final phase, it's a 45-day process, and it's really just an opportunity for the Corps to review what you've changed and make a decision whether or not they're going to sign the instrument. We'll talk more about that too, because it doesn't appear to be that's all that's happening when you look at some of the time frame. So quick and dirty overview of the review process. So at the DMBI phase, WAC is ready to approve and often does approve at the end of that phase. The Corps or the federal process then goes on to FMBI, and a lot of times LGUs today now are deferring that decision on their plan under WACA until the Corps finishes the final instrument. Why? Because what happened for a long time was that under WACA, they would approve it at the DMBI phase or sometime shortly thereafter. The Corps would continue with their process. There might be additional changes made to the plan based on the federal comments. They approve, and you have two different plans that were approved between the agencies or the programs. Not a good way of doing things, we learned. Any questions on the review process before I move on? No? Okay, let's go. So in terms of the draft prospectus and the prospectus, I have changed my tune on this a little bit over the last couple of years. I used to not think of these as a really key or important part of the review process, just steps that you needed to work through. I'm changing my tune on that, like I said, because looking at how the process has unfolded, these are really, in my opinion, critical stages for bank sponsors to get feedback to make those third and fourth phases much smoother. And let's just talk a little bit about kind of a hypothetical timeline. So for this, let's assume that the agencies are providing feedback on time at each stage. So they're meeting those timeframes in the rule, and that sponsors are turning things around in 30 days once they get comments back. Both those highly unrealistic, but for purposes of an example, let's just walk through it that way. So let's say that you today you're submitting a draft prospectus. Now I'm trying to illustrate how these two phases can affect your timeframes. And we'll start with the assumption that you're also going to do the draft prospectus for this timeline. So you submit a draft prospectus in November, so currently. So according to the perspective, or the DP timeframe, in 30 days, you should have your comments back. And if you can turn it around and resubmit your prospectus, let's say at the end of December, early January, you would start that next phase at that time. So you're turning it around real quick, which honestly for a draft prospectus phase is not unrealistic if you get the comments back in 30 days. So you get your prospectus submitted in December, and the review for that is 90 days. And you get your comments, your initial evaluation letter back. Actually, I think I had the submittal in mid-December. And then the prospectus in mid-December, and then you get your comments back in mid-March, your initial evaluation letter. You then turn that around in 30 days and submitted your draft instrument in mid-April. That's a 90-day review. So you would then get your status update letter in mid-July. You take 30 days to turn that around, submit your final instrument, and in 45 days, you then have your decision. So let's assume that at that point, your decision then is that your bank project was approved. What's the challenge with getting a decision at that date in Minnesota? So you're talking October, mid-October. Ben Hodap, I know you know the answer to this question because I helped you with the project where this was an issue.
It's a combo between construction or planning for A or sod seeding or what's gonna happen in that interim.
Yeah, so what you're running into is that it's really late to make a decision on doing construction. And almost too late. So when I was the mitigation coordinator at Bowser, we were having to make the decisions about construction in months. Because if you got to go out and get free bids and have all your permits in place, schedule construction, and then wait for the right weather timing to construct the site, you're really pushing it if you're waiting until September, October to do that. So you can always plan ahead, but there are challenges, certainly, if you get an approval this time. And then from a banker's perspective, if you're not getting construction this fall, now you're waiting till when to construct. What does it cost you if you don't make that timeline in the fall? So for a lot of projects, if you don't make it in the fall, you can't construct in the spring either. Because it's usually too wet. And the weather is too unpredictable in that early part of the growing season. So you can't get out there and do the work then either. So then what happens? Well, you can't do it midsummer because you don't want to seed in the middle of the summer because that's just throwing good money at bad. So you're back to the fall again before you're going to be able to construct. So from a sponsor's perspective, if you don't hit that date, it just costs you a year in your schedule. And I can assure you that for a long time, because I was one of them, agency staff never thought of this. Didn't care. I think that's changed a little bit today, but certainly there was a fair amount of a lack of sympathy for bank sponsors who would complain about, if you don't get me a decision by here, I can't construct. Well, that's the reality. So that's a problem. If you're starting out with DP for a project, you're probably not going to have any credits for 2 years, maybe a little bit more. So that's a challenge from a banking standpoint. So let's look at a different example where you start with, you're confident enough about your project that you're going to start with prospectus. So you cut some time off that timeline, but in laying out the same assumptions in the same time frame we looked at earlier, you really don't get all that much benefit in terms of the time frame. And again, this assumes that all your review periods are done according to the time frame of the rule, and you're turning things around in 30 days. That's really optimistic. So even under this, if you drop the DP phase and you go to prospectus, you're still looking at late summer, early fall before you would have an approval that you could take action on and implement. So again, that could mean bumping another year before you get to construction. So keep that in mind as we talk about the next couple of things. So last year, this group, there was a group, the Ecosystem Restoration Business Association, I think I have that spelled. and this other group, Aquic, did a study of core data for the review timeframes for wetland mitigation, for not just wetland mitigation, wetland and stream mitigation. I have a copy up here if you want to look at afterwards. It's a really interesting study. It's both a review of the timeframes for mitigation bank reviews, but also the data collection and reliability that the Corps has with their program. So that part I glossed over. I was more interested in timeframes, but keep in mind the example hypothetical that we just went through as we look at these next couple of slides. So this one, the colors are a little transformed from my computer to the screen, but so looking at data from 2014 to 2021, they went and evaluated each phase of the review process. And they looked specifically at, were able to break up the data between the federal review timeframes, the sponsors timeframes. Excuse me. I had a cold last week and my throat's going to suffer right now. The sponsors timeframes, and then also what they called, I can't remember, there was a category for like that completeness determination period, which is kind of a catch-all. So this time was lost here, but not really sure whose responsibility it was because there might have been some back. But if you look at this, I'm going to put my mechanical eyes on to be able to read the text. The green is the final instrument. So that is the last phase. So the 45-day FMBI period. The darkest color is the draft instrument or DNBI, which is a 90-day review. And the gray is Prospectus, which is a 90-day review. So the vertical line, the first one there, is that 45-day review period. The second vertical line is the 90-day review period. So interestingly enough, from the data that they compiled, the Prospectus is the longest phase of the review process. That surprised me, because I honestly didn't think that much went into a prospectus that would take the agencies that much time to kick off your initial evaluation model. The other surprise on this data is the FMBI time. Because as I mentioned earlier, that really is a decision on whether or not they're going to sign the instrument. That is also a very long part of the review process for just the federal component. Much longer than I would have expected for something like that. So there's some variability year by year on this, but this is kind of an aggregation of the data. So the important takeaway is they're really not getting this done on time at any phase on a regular basis. And we'll look at in a second how the St. Paul district lines up. So on average, the Corps has not been able to complete prospectus stage within 90 days. And as I mentioned, the prospectus stage, is the most time-consuming phase of the process. So again, what I said earlier, I changed my tune on this because there's a real problem with this phase in terms of the review periods. So putting a little bit more attention on this is probably warranted. So in terms of the St. Paul district, and this box plot's a little bit hard to decipher. So I'll just explain it real quick. The red box around those three districts is that last quartile, or the sort of the 75th quartile, the third quartile on this data. So those are the ones that are performing very close to the bottom. And you'll see the St. Paul district in there, and I don't highlight that to call them out, and I'll explain why in a second. But I went for this box plot and pulled out their district-specific data. Prospectus, 159 days. Remember, that's a 90-day review period. DNBI, 131 days, 90-day review period. FMBI, 120 days. That is a 45-day review period for a total federal review of 410 days. Again, based on the data in the study. That additional time, that's sort of not sure who's responsible for this time. It could go back and forth. There could be some information being exchanged prior to a completeness determination. That was 410 days. And then the sponsor time. So that's the time where the Corps finishes. Now it's been put back in the sponsor's hands to make edits or changes, 593 days. So the total time average for the St. Paul district during this period 1,300 days for the review process, so 3.6 years. That's a long time to be paying a consultant or whoever to manage this process. That's a long time. That also means that as a bank sponsor, when you look at investing in a market to develop credits, your risk and uncertainty, in my opinion, is pretty high. If your review period is 3.6 years and then you construct and then you get credits, a small amount of your credits, with the bulk of them coming another year later. So your planning horizon or the market you're trying to enter, you're entering it 4 to 5 years down the road when you engage the process. That's scary in wetland banking, in my opinion. So something to think about. So let's move on and talk about each of these stages. So I come back to that. So with that understanding of that data, the more you can do early on to provide information that's meaningful to the agencies and get meaningful feedback, and also manage that review time early on so that you're on schedule as much as you can be, is going to pay off for you down the road, I think. And certainly the people I'm working with on banking, we are all over that and trying to manage that part of the review process as efficiently as we can. I should say, to clarify for the St. Paul district, they're in that bottom quartile in terms of performance. But there is no other district in the country that has the workload that the St. Paul district does. I think the number on the previous slide for that period, 2014 through 2021, they approved 92 banks. That was by far the most across the country. So that includes Wisconsin and Minnesota, but that's a lot of banks. And if you think about what's going on now in the St. Paul district, there's going to be even more because stream mitigation is popping up. So that's going to probably increase their workload. And that is more time consuming, at least right now, than the wetland part of the programs. So I don't want to throw doom and gloom, but keep that in mind as well. All right, let's talk quickly about draft prospectus and what we can do with that. So as I mentioned, it's the only optional phase. It's really just a preliminary look at your project. So you submit it, it's disseminated to the IRT. They have a very short window to comment, get their comments back to the Corps and get you something. So again, like I mentioned, sandwiching all this in 30 days is almost unrealistic. It's very difficult for them to manage this part of the process in that short of amount of time. I mean, think about it if you were managing it. You get something in, your job is to disseminate it to agency staff that you don't work for and you don't set their priorities. You need them to review it and get you comments back. You need to take those, write your own letter, do your own review, take their comments, incorporate their comments into your review, route a letter and get it out within 30 days. It doesn't happen. So when you think about this stage, there are, I'll get into that. There are things you can do and evaluate, well, whether or not this is even worth it. And then if you do decide to engage, I'll give you in just a minute, Jen. And if you do decide to engage, how you can make the most of the review process if you make that decision. If you have a question, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, interviewing that checklist, it needs sponsors, I think.
Yep, I'll go over that. Yep. So there are the examples here. Like I said, I've developed this training module for more of a, it has a national approach to it. So I have some examples in here from other districts, which the St. Paul district does the same thing. They'll look and see what other folks are doing because why reinvent the wheel? So there are district specific guidance documents that have been prepared. They're very helpful. I didn't really cover them too much for draft prospectus because if you use the prospectus ones for this phase, you'll end up producing the same document that you're going to turn in at the next one. So the examples I have on here are very specific draft prospectus checklists or guidance information on how to make the most of it. And I'll go through the core St. Paul district's prospectus one when we talk about that phase. So here are my tips if you're getting into the bank review process. when you think about prospectus, and I've talked to some of you about this. If you are experienced in the bank review process, if you've done these, Ben Hodap's done a number of banks. Ben would be one that if I were at the agencies, if he submitted a DP to me, I'd call him up and say, why are you doing this? You know this stuff, and you don't need the feedback from a DP unless Ben contacted me and said, I'm submitting a DP specifically for these two reasons. This is what I want. So the point there is, if you are experienced in wetland banking and you're confident and you know sites and you know the rules and you've done this before, I don't think you need to do DP. And I think some of the agency staff would echo, because you're just gumming up the system. But if you have a project that you have something you've not dealt with, and you don't know if your client should be investing more into this site, that's a great time to use the DP. But call it out specifically when you submit it. Hey, I'm submitting this. This is what I need feedback on. You may get something back in 30 days if you give a very focused request. But don't submit a DP where you've got this potential red flag issue, but you don't identify it. You may not get any feedback on it, and then you've wasted your time and theirs. So DP is really for, or I would say really for, I think it's best used for situations where you're unfamiliar with the process and you're not sure you're hitting all the targets before you formally submit a prospectus, or you're familiar with it and you have specific issues that you need feedback on before you have a client invest any more in a site. And those experienced people will know how to generate the information to get that feedback. Does that make sense? So it's something to think about. I know when I was at the agencies reviewing things, it was not uncommon in a month to potentially get 4 to 6 DPs. And half of them you would look at and say, why are we looking at this? It just takes up time. I mean, there were 92 banks approved in that period. There were probably another 40 that started the review process that never made it through. So the volume of documents that the agency staff were having to review for this is enormous. So the more we can do to help them by not creating additional workload is a good move. Okay. Let me move on and let's talk about prospectus. Before I get into that, I found this out a couple months ago. The EPA hired or contracted to have what they call mitigation bank prospectus review workflow draft. So that is the image I have in the slide. I have a copy of it here. I did not know they did this. We have an IRT member present. Has the IRT ever talked about this document? No. The answer is no. Okay. So I was surprised. I hadn't heard of it, but I'm not, in the agency email string anymore. So I was surprised. If you go in and look at this, the intended audience are IRT members, so the people doing the review. But it is the most comprehensive and thorough layout of what the agencies are looking for and what each of the requirements in the federal mitigation rule mean that I've ever seen. It's kind of shocking that it hasn't got more press. And there's one for each phase of the review process, not for the draft prospectus, but they've created one of these for each phase. Very helpful in my opinion. So I'm going to kind of walk through the prospectus stage using that as kind of a document to help illustrate what they're looking for. So let's jump in. So Jenny mentioned that, the St. Paul district has a checklist and some guidelines. So here's some guidance documents that if you're looking at this, or you're interested in what's out there and learn more, the St. Paul district has a prospectus checklist on their mitigation page. It looks like, I think I have a copy. It looks like this, with a red castle instead of the failed orange printer version that I have. It's a good list. I've looked at a number of the checklists for prospectus. It follows the rule pretty thoroughly with a lot of verbatim text from the rule. So a lot of districts are reluctant to take something like this and really put their own guidance on it because they're not supposed to be doing that anymore. So this one actually is pretty good. Where it needs to have some additional explanation, it has it. So if you're preparing a prospectus, you should probably have this on your desk or open on your computer. Because this tells you what you're gonna need for completeness. And then also some of the details, also associated with that. The joint agency prospectus form, is another source of information. And if you've done a prospectus, you're familiar with this, every item on the form has some explanation on what they're looking for in those sections. So I have to be honest, when this form was developed, I think I was at Bowser, I do not like forms for these documents. If you're pursuing a wetland bank, you need to put your big boy pants on and write your own document. And having a form that basically pulls you through the process, I think is a bit over the top. But we were getting so many different versions of prospectus and different information here and there and everywhere that it had to be standardized, so this is the outcome. I will say though, that, and I'll mention this later on, you can delete the instructions when you submit something. I always encourage people that, yeah, follow this, but you can do your own outline. You don't need to use this form, because the formatting gets wonky, it gets hard. Take the major headings, keep the organization the same, but use your own outline and develop your own document. You don't have to use this kind of a fillable form. So, okay, let's go through the prospectus. I mentioned it's required for all bank proposals, and the federal mitigation rule says it's a summary of the bank proposal at a level of detail sufficient to support informed review and comment by the IRT and the public. Great statement. I don't think it really tells you much in terms of what you're supposed to put together. So we'll dive into that deeper and kind of illuminate some of the major elements that need to be in there. As I mentioned, also culminates with the Corps providing that initial evaluation letter. The important thing to remember is that if you get in the initial evaluation letter a statement that, yes, we think this project has merit and can generate credits, that is not an approval of your project. That is an initial assessment. The devil's in the details at the next stage. So don't think that you have that and you can run to the finish line and say, I got an IEL that says it has merit and we're good to go. It just means that based on the information you provided, you could move forward with their support to continue engaging the process. So the review begins when a prospectus is received by the Corps. I mentioned that they have to do their completeness determination. There's no time frame on that. Hopefully they're on that quickly. We'll talk more about how to manage that part of it. I've kind of gone over a bit some of these timeframes. There is a public notice. It follows the same public notice procedures that they use for permits. So you're subject to a 30-day review period, at the end of which they should be sending you, if you are working the agent for the sponsor, you should be getting a copy of all those comments. Sometimes they wait and send it with a letter. When I'm working with bank sponsors and working with the agencies, I try to get those comment letters as soon as I can, so you get an idea of what's coming. And we'll talk more about that too. Let's move on and talk about the prospectus. So what needs to be in it? So this is right out of the federal mitigation rule. There are 8 elements that need to be in there. Objectives, how the bank will be established and operated, the service area, need and technical feasibility, ownership arrangements, qualifications of the sponsor, ecological suitability of the site, and assurance of sufficient water rights. Pretty straightforward stuff, right? 3 to 4 page max, right? Not quite. But the interesting part about this is when you look at these requirements, they don't translate real well to what we actually do in preparing bank documents. For example, when you say how the bank will be established and operated, I can tell you for years, bank sponsors submitted prospectus, that section might have only been 2 paragraphs long. And it was fine because our understanding of established and operated was pretty simple. Today, again, using that guidance document, looking at things, established and operated really means how is it going to be constructed and maintained? And by constructed, we're asking for what structures are going to be out there? What physical work are you going to do? Are you going to restore hydrology? So the detail today, the understanding is much more than it was when we first started reviewing this. which is a good thing. It's just the evolution of what some of these terms mean and how that's getting into the joint, the agency prospectus form or the checklist. So, and as bank sponsors or agents for bank sponsors, you really need to understand, when you hear this, this is what it means and this is what they're looking for. All right, so let's kind of walk through these. This is the check or the checklist that the St. Paul district uses. And it really is a guide. You see the boxes next to each one of those elements. It's almost a guide for them for completeness determination. So if you're preparing a prospectus and you can't go through your own document and check these boxes, you don't have a complete prospectus. There's certainly some things that are subject to interpretation, but you can do your own check and make sure that you've addressed one of these. They may come back and say, well, you addressed it, but it's so thin on detail, we're not calling it complete. That can always happen. The other thing I'll note with this form is that the red box there, that's information that they're saying correctly, it's not required. And we can't tell you you're not complete if you don't have this, but you might want to think about adding this stuff in there because it's really going to benefit. So they have gone and looked at sort of their program and said, this additional information really helps us give you feedback on your project at this phase, which will help you with subsequent phases. So you really should pay attention to this. This is the kind of stuff that really aids the review process. So again, it's not required to be complete, but you should really be thinking about including this because it's going to give them what they need and save them time. Okay. So the first required element, objectives. And it's interesting because most of the time you see objectives like NEPA or other things that throw this out. What's always associated with it? It's not just objectives, it's your chance to respond. Goals, right? Goals and objectives. Federal mitigation rule, they only want objectives. So, unfortunately, objectives often come from goals, so you're often going to end up putting a goal in there anyway, but objectives identify the specific components necessary to accomplish the mitigation bank goal. Think about performance standards when developing objectives for the bank. So I put in a couple of snapshots of like HGM guidebooks because if your goals and your objectives are really wetland function based, you should talk about those in your objectives. And the green box kind of has some examples that I pulled out of some other prospectus with bank plans. So you can use that sort of thing to tie all this together. And it's not a really challenging element for a complete prospectus, but your objectives will ripple through all the other stuff in your document. So your objectives will probably have a relationship with your performance standards because that is really how you're measuring success towards meeting objectives. And monitoring, of course, feeds into that and your credits and all that stuff. So put a little thought into it as you look at your site and kind of remember you're connecting the dots on all this and trying to have all these things come together and tell the story about what you're doing on the site. Number two, how the bank can be established and operated. I talked about this a little bit already. A high-level overview of the site work plan, including location, the type of mitigation, general baseline conditions, concept plan of the bank layout. So there's the big one, concept plan. So I'm fairly certain for a while with Prospectus that we weren't, and I'm speaking from when I was at the agencies working for either the state or the Corps, we weren't expecting to see plans or any sort of design. I think today you have to have that information. You really need to put it in. It doesn't have to be a final design. It doesn't have to be crazy over the top, but you need to be able to show them at that site, what are you proposing to do? Do you have an outlet structure? Are you breaking tile? And of course, if you've been through the process, you know the interval that Tom Wenzel wants to see tile breaks at, and there's that mitigation or wetland restoration handbook that Bowser has. Very simply take that information and lay it out so that they can see what you're doing on that site. If that, like I said, it doesn't have to be crazy over the top with detail, but they really want to know, what are you doing? So some sort of concept plan at a level of detail where an engineer could look at it and say, okay, I understand they're doing this, this, and this, and perhaps give you some comment back on it that will help you before you put the effort into that design plan. And here's the challenge with the way the review process is laid out. If you don't do that at Prospectus, and you come in cold and blind at the DMVI phase with the design plan, do you think that you're gonna get through that phase without a lot of comments? You won't. So the more you can engage at that level at the Prospectus and give the reviewers a chance to get you the feedback, the better the quality of your DMVI submittal and the greater the likelihood that you're gonna move through the process more efficiently. I don't think there's a bank out there that hasn't had some sort of back and forth about the site plan, the level of detail, you need this, you need that. That almost becomes a side discussion at DNVI between Tom Wenzel and his staff that are doing the engineering review for all the banks in Minnesota and the bank sponsors. It almost takes a separate track. There's heads nodding in the room for those of you who aren't with us, so maybe the camera's picking those up because it picks up all movement, right? Nice. Anyway. So I mentioned this, what established and operated, mean, there's a lot of variability in how core districts approach the level of detail for this one. I think St. Paul is a little on the, less detailed side. That doesn't mean they don't want it. I just know there are other districts that essentially, this is a draft version of the DNVI. They want that level of detail. So all kinds of work is put into their perspectives. I haven't seen that out of St. Paul, but they certainly want more information now than I know we did, let's say 10 years ago. And then the figures that really illustrate that plan are important too. Moving on, service areas. This is the gift in Minnesota that the agencies have given you. You don't have to really do much with service areas in Minnesota because they're set by the agencies. In other states, it's a bank by bank decision that a sponsor proposes service areas, and there's even a negotiation at times regarding what your service area may be. And it changes every so many years about what the agencies may allow and not allow. So I mentioned at the Water Resources Conference that the state agencies in Minnesota have done a nice job with the bank service areas in creating markets, competitive markets, where there's enough demand to have people invest in sell credits. And that's these 10 service areas. So if we had a different way of doing it, like this is, I think it's like a modified HUC 4, HUC 6, depending on how you look at it. But in other states where I'm doing work, they use HUC 8s as bank service areas. And this is how a HUC 8 market would look in Minnesota. So imagine if you were a bank sponsor and this was your market and you got to be, your service area was a single HUC 8. That would be a really challenging market. Now go back to, and add in what I said earlier about you're 5 years out from getting credits. You may look at a HUC 8 today that's hot and there's no credits. Let's invest. By the time you get 5 years out, that peak demand may have dropped and there may be 3 other banks in the same service area and you're going to sell credit. So these bigger service areas are a good thing. And when you get to identifying service areas on a prospectus, it's probably the fastest part of your document. Matter of fact, if you look at the joint agency prospectus template, there's not even a spot on there for service area. On the front page, you just write in the number and you move on. So you don't have to spend any time talking about service. Need and technical feasibility. Yeah, need and technical feasibility, sorry. So need really gets at, from an agency perspective, what's the basis or justification for establishing your wetland bank in this area? Is it really needed? Do they need credits? Do they need a certain type of credits? Do we need a bank in a certain part of this BSA or in another part? So it's your job to basically tell them, we're investing here and this is why. This is why we need to generate those credits. So in order to do that, and if you read the checklist and the explanation from this, it's a very simplified example. It reads something like, oh, there are no banks in this service area, so we're going to step in and fill a need. Well, I can tell you right now in Minnesota, there's pretty much banks in every bank service area. So that's probably not a great need assessment. But one of the things you can do is put together kind of what I had done here as a sample. You can do a credit inventory. So you could look at who's selling credits there now. What do they have in inventory right now? And what are they forecasted to have for the next 5, 7, 10 years? So you could really look at from a need analysis. It's pretty data intensive to pull this. And the other part of it that's missing is what's the demand? So most bankers will know the answer to that question, because if you're going to invest in somewhere, you got an idea of what the demand's going to be. So what gets difficult with that is that a lot of people are proprietary with that information, and they don't want their data crunching and their analysis of markets to become too well known. But you can go and pull information out of Rivets on credit use by bank service area. You can work through that data. It takes a little bit, and you got to be familiar with it to a certain extent. You can do a FOIA request and get permitting data from the Corps. You can look at balances over time on the Bowser website for their listing. If you do screenshots of a certain market on a 6-month basis, you can track what's going on there. So there are ways to do it, but the bottom line is they're asking you, what's the basis for putting a bank here? Why should we approve your bank? Is it really needed? So pretty straightforward stuff there, just requires a little data mining. I think this is becoming more of an area where people are really starting to dive into the data, as opposed to the simplified answer, like I mentioned earlier, where it's like, well, we need banks. There's only one bank. So, yes, question, Jenny.
Well, a statement. I just think with the stream, everything coming online, this would be an easier component. So sometimes if you're able to incorporate streaming crediting and Wetland, because there's so few, it's like almost starting fresh in a way.
Yes, I don't do, do you think that the auto's picking her up back there? I'll just repeat it. So Jenny's comment was, the progression or the development of the Corps' stream mitigation program, or stream mitigation in general in Minnesota, is going to help with justification, because you will, if that's a component of projects, if you have a stream mitigation part of an otherwise wetland bank, certainly there's very few stream credits, if any, available right now. I know there's a couple approved, but that's a developing market. It is really at the very beginning of that. So projects with stream credits having probably an easier justification of the Corps along the lines of there's a need here than you might see for wetland credits in today's market. Good point. Let's keep moving along here. Technical feasibility. I, for a long time, did not have this view of what this meant. And I'm glad that guidance document clarified it, because I think this is a really important point. Whether implementation of the bank project is possible given current science and technology and is compatible with project site characteristics. So really, when I was at the agencies, we sometimes call this the red flag review. That is there something clearly on this site that's a problem for it being established? And that even could be offsite things as well. But it really is a description of technically, can you do this work? And technically meaning, can you get the water to the site? Can you keep the water on the site? Do you have a right to put the water on the site? Are there things around the site that are really going to be prohibited to you doing the restoration? So are there ditches that can't be disabled? Is your site completely surrounded by reed canary grass, such that once you open that soil up, you're going to be fighting reed canary grass for years? And I've seen that comment on bank proposals, that the likelihood of you succeeding with this from a vegetative standpoint is very low. So those are the things that they're really looking at. A lot of this feeds into that engineering part and that plan. Can you do what you think you're going to, can you do the restoration in a way that you're going to be successful in terms of outcomes? So I mentioned here at the bottom, this required element is critical to effectively managing the review process. So there's 2 of those in here. This is the first, technical feasibility, because it also comes down to some of those detailed parts of it, like, actually, I'll talk about that in ecological suitability. There's some overlap in some of these, and I'll hold on to that comment. Ownership arrangements. For the longest time, I don't think as well, when I was at the agency, that we paid much attention to this. But has anybody pushed through a wetland bank with an LLC as a sponsor? Interesting. That's a challenge. And has anybody pushed through a wetland bank where your sponsor is not the owner of the land where the restoration will occur? So there's a couple heads nodding. Yeah, okay. So that's a challenge too, because with the instrument, when the sponsor signs the instrument, the sponsor has to have the ability to access that property to do the work required for the restoration, not only initially, but long-term, to get on that site and do the work. So if you're not the owner, the Corps' position right off the bat is you don't have rights. So you need to secure those rights. And there's ways to do that. But in this particular case, or this particular element, this is where you flush that out. So if you are the sponsor and you're not the owner, you will need to have some arrangement. The Corps has some templates. I'm working on a project right now in Wisconsin where we have to do this. And maybe this is the perfect storm for issues because it's an LLC that doesn't own the land. So the LLC is a challenge because the Corps wants to see so an LLC is a great way of doing a bank and, you're limiting liability amongst a number of partners. But the problem is somebody's got to sign that instrument, right? And the LLC then has to establish the person who has signature authority for the LLC. Again, not a big deal, but something we weren't thinking about years ago. And I think the attorneys from the Corps did a great job of sort of hammering this out and providing templates that can be used to do it. But the point for this one is they want to flush all this out at this phase. So the more you think about this going into it, the less comments you're going to have and the less scrambling you're going to do later on. So at Prospectus, if you don't have the sponsor as a landowner, or if you have an LLC, or you have both, you have some work to do to clarify the ownership arrangement. The cleanest and most straightforward is the owner is the bank sponsor. Pretty straightforward. Any other arrangement, you're going to need to provide them some information to describe how that's going to work. Make sense? Like I said, they have plenty of templates that can help with that too. It also, this one I should mention, gets into other rights on the property. So utility easements, drainage easements, and the state of Minnesota Bowser, their reviewers do a great job flushing this stuff out and asking for it. Because now is the time of Prospectus, and one of the slides I need to talk about is the right time to have an initial title search now. Because you do not want those issues to come up at the end when you're trying to get your conservation easement. That's when the real detailed work is done on those titles. You want to do some initial work now at Prospectus to at least start looking at those to see if your titles work. It's burned many a wetland bank. There are mineral rights, even as far down as the metro, where we're at, where people have come in and bought out mineral rights underneath lands, and the owners don't even know. But, and you dealt with this big time, I'm looking at that because he had this very issue come up. It's really difficult to buy those rights out because the Corps will not approve the bank if there are severed mineral rights or exploration or extraction underneath that site. It's not going to get approved. The state is very reluctant to accept an easement for something like that, but they can sign, I think it's called a non-disturbance agreement or something like that. They're willing to, in cases where the one who owns the rights is unwilling to sell. Bowser has worked out some arrangements for that. They don't like to, they prefer not to. But it's a really difficult, it will add 6 months easily to your process dealing with that issue. And the trouble with it is, if you don't look now for those things, and you get an approved project, and you're ready to go with construction, you're not, because you don't have the approval, or the legal approvals needed to get your bank approved. So you're not going to go anywhere until it's resolved. So it's better to work this in parallel rather than in series in terms of the review process. Okay, ecological suitability. This is the other big one. I don't like the initial description of this in the federal mitigation rule. The physical, chemical, and biological characteristics of the bank site and how the site will support the planned types of aquatic resources and function. There's not a lot of detail, in the federal mitigation rule on this. But the guidance document refers you back to another part of the federal mitigation rule that covers all forms of mitigation, and it's the site selection part. So if you want to learn more about how to address this section, I recommend looking at that. I think I put some stuff in here on that. Really, what you're getting at is, and this is where, in my opinion, so many of the comments from the agencies come from. So for example, if you submit a prospectus and you're saying you're going to restore 40 acres of wetland on the site, do you think you should have hydric soils in the area where you're going to restore wetland? Yes, you probably should. If you don't, you need to have an explanation. And this is where this element is getting at. All these ecological suitabilities. If you don't have hydric soils, you say you're going to restore wetlands there, you're going to get a comment back that says, I don't think this was wetland beforehand, so it's not even eligible. It might be creation, but it's not restoration. So if you don't address that question right off, you're definitely going to get a comment back. So you need to think about these elements, particularly this one, because this really comes into your prospectus that has the section on historical conditions. So you're going to need to go back as far as you can, or piece information together that describes what was there before the disturbance occurred, that essentially gives you the opportunity to restore. So what drainage was put in? You know, did they go in and plow it? It basically drain it via plowing, which happens in some cases. Did they cut off surface flow, upgrading of the site and reroute it such that you can bring that back? You know, all kinds of different disturbance related activities, but you're going to need to set the stage for what it was, what it is today, and the outcome of that is where you're going to. That is going to drive all the important stuff for your project, which is credit. And if you can't set the stage for that, you're going to get a lot of comments. So this is really important. So you have to go back and talk about soils that were there, the hydro regime that was there, vegetation that may have been present. You go back to those original survey notes, all that stuff is building your case for it. And if you don't put it in there, you're going to get asked for it, because this is a really important part of that initial evaluation. So I can't emphasize enough how much you need to spend. This is where you're going to spend all your time. This and on that preliminary design, because these are the ones that drive the whole process in terms of getting you to a point where you have a project where they support it, and you can get an idea what you're going to get out of it credit-wise. We really don't talk much about credit yield at Prospectus, which of course is what your investors, your bank sponsors want to know, right? What am I going to get out of it? Well, this information is what drives that calculation. So assurance of water rights, we are blessed in this part of the country that we have plenty of water. So this element doesn't get a lot of scrutiny up here. If you are west of the Mississippi, a couple hundred miles, you would probably be asked to really provide some information on this. Really what we're looking at in Minnesota, in the photo, the pool-like structure there is, do you really have the hydrology that you think you do? Which is the photo of the wetland with water in it. Or do you have something that is really structure or diversion or something based? We don't see a lot of projects in Minnesota that don't have that right side photo. The hydrology we can nail here without too much trouble. There's some sites that are more challenging than others, but we don't run into the things like the photo on the left where it's suspect whether or not every year you're going to get water in that site. Certainly in the arid west, they deal with that all the time. So this is just one where you need to be able to talk about the source of the water for the site and that permanence of getting it there every year. So if there's a seasonality component to your hydrology, that let's say you're doing a floodplain wetland restoration and you have a berm and river and you can't take that away because of some floodplain issues, but you could notch it or something. You're going to need to justify that water will get up. If that's the primary source of hydrology for your restoration, you're going to have to demonstrate that at a reasonable return interval, what water's gonna get from that river at flood stage into your center. If you don't, you're probably not gonna get the agencies to say that you're effectively restoring. All right, so I went through, just so you get an idea of what to expect, in an initial evaluation letter. I tried to redact everything that may, identify this particular project. You know what? I didn't bring my calculator. But let's go through this real quick because I put some arrows in there. So the first arrow really is the sort of live or die statement in an initial evaluation letter. A lot of that first paragraph is kind of just standard text, but what you're looking for in the first paragraph is that statement about whether or not they think it has merit. So that is kind of your, you can continue, or you have some problems and they might even make you resubmit a prospectus. So that is the first thing to pay attention to in the letter. The next couple paragraphs are, again, kind of stock text that kind of talk to you about the process and if you're moving forward, this, that, and the other. You get down to the bottom of the first page and you get into the comments that they've provided. And these are important because they're really setting the stage for, if you go forward, this is what we're going to expect you're going to address. And in the DNBI, you should have in either your cover letter or that first section of that document, how you address each one of these. I tried to, when I was at both the state and the Corps, I tried to get people to specify which ones were substantive, meaning you must address this one, as opposed to some that were more recommendation oriented. This particular letter doesn't make a distinction between any of those, and the comments are actually pretty good comments for the most part, so all of these should probably be addressed. If you get a comment letter back like this, and you're not quite sure what's substantive and what's not, and there's some of them you're like, well, we really don't want to do that, you need to talk to the person who sent you the letter before you do much work. Because it's really going to be important as you move forward, because some of these will change your project. Or make you do a whole bunch of fact finding to justify something that you may or may not have to do. So it's good to have that conversation. So let's look at that first paragraph there. It's the engineering and zoning lateral effects. It's really getting at and that level of comment that talks about, okay, you have ditches on here and you need to adjust your crediting and your description of the project based on what you're doing with those ditches. So that's an important comment that kind of ripples through a number of things. And we can talk more about the details. I know in the interest of time, I'm going to keep moving. At the top of the second page, here's something from the Bowser engineer. So you actually have them providing comments. The Corps has said, we agree with the comments. So guess what? You're going to need to address those comments. So this is where you often get that parallel discussion going on between your design person, if you're not that person, and Tom Wenzel. To talk about his comments and how they can be addressed. I mean, you can't ignore those comments. Well, don't ignore Tom Wenzel's comments. It makes them a little crushed. So they were clear that should you not wish to follow the Bowser engineer's recommendations, please do not proceed to DNBI without first scheduling a meeting with the IRT and the Bowser engineer. So if you don't agree, like I said, and you're planning to move forward, you need to have a meeting. So take that seriously. That's a pretty bold statement there from them in the review, in their comment. Let's see, moving down to this one. Credit allocation table, credit release schedules need to use the standard number format. I highlighted this one, and there's a couple other ones. The agencies have been making this comment, I think, for 8 to 10 years about the numbers. So there's guidance on this. There's all kinds of commentary on it. I know it drives some of the reviewers nuts when these numbers don't come in the right way. It's a simple comment to make, but if you're a repeat offender of this, you need to think about changing your ways because it really needs to not happen. So there's this and some other stuff that if they keep happening time and time again, you're basically taking up time in the review process for something that the agencies have made it fairly clear how they expect to see this stuff, so you need to pay attention to that and not keep making that mistake. The next one, same thing, if you look at 5, performance standards and credit release schedule. The hydrology performance standards have been around for years. They were published. They're pretty stock. You can pick them up and drop them in. You could certainly propose your own standards, but if you drop them in and they are different from typically what the agencies are used to seeing, you better explain why you're doing something. They're open to that. They're open to you proposing things. I've not seen it approved a whole lot of times. But if you're gonna do something that's a little different, explain it, justify it to them, or you're gonna get a comment like this. And that first one, the shallow marsh hydrology standards should specify inundation period of at least 20 consecutive days, inundation longer than 28 days is acceptable. I think that's right out of those hydrology performance standards. So again, check what you're putting in against what they had put out as sort of the standards for this. And if you're going to deviate from it, explain why. Long-term management plan. This is an interesting comment because long-term management for a long time in the review process was kind of the, not really sure what to do with this because it's certainly required in the federal mitigation rule, but it's not evolved to the point in Minnesota and Wisconsin. Well, Wisconsin has a little better. In Minnesota where it should be to comply with the rule. Meaning, you should have a long-term management plan with all the details on it set up when your bank is approved, and you should have a funding source set aside. There are very few banks in Minnesota that have long-term management funds set up. There's a couple, but there's not many. And I think that the tide is coming, and there's a change coming with that. So you should expect in the future that if you have a bank site and you have a structure, if you have a water control or outlet structure that has boards or some sort of control, there's going to be an expectation that that's going to have to be maintained and replaced at some point. And you may have to, your client as a bank sponsor, may have to set aside some money for that to be done. That's unpopular in Minnesota. The folks I've talked to, some of the bank sponsors, is another cost for an otherwise expensive program. But it is a standard in other parts of the country. You just don't get approved unless you have this. So that's something to think about. I think what they're asking in the comment on this letter is to think about long-term maintenance. So if you're going to have a structure, you need to explain to us how that's going to be maintained. How often is it going to require maintenance? What are you going to need to do to it? And that applies to anything you really do with the site that may degrade over time. Certainly, long-term management should include vegetation management too. Jason's not here, but he dealt with a financial assurance for prescribed burns that he got worked out on a bank that he did. And I think they actually had to put money aside, and Anoka County Conservation District was then going to draw on those funds to do those prescribed burns after that monitoring period. So long-term management that was set up that the burns were going to be done because that was important to maintaining quality of the sites. So don't be surprised that this grows in the future. See the requirement for that comment more. Ownership, we talked about this. I just wanted to flag this because this is exactly the treatment of LLCs I was talking about. Okay, you're doing an LLC and they're not the property owner. You need to clarify for us how this is going to work. There needs to be an agreement between the LLC and the landowner, such that they have access via some sort of easement to come on and do the work. And then we need to know who the authority or the person who will be signing for the LLCs. So that's becoming more standard. I think there tends to be more and more LLCs doing banks. I mean, I know the folks I work with, Ecosystem Investment Partners, their banks are all done by LLCs. So they set up a LLC for each bank that they do, they manage it that way. They have these things set up, the signature authority, they have the ownership relationships with the LLCs laid out, and all that documentation is provided to the agencies so they can look at it and be comfortable with it. And then the last one, they did put in here, we encourage you to contact us to set up a meeting to discuss your project and any questions you may have and any information requirements above. That's great. And people should be taking advantage of that. I'll talk about that a little more in a couple slides, but it's really important that, bank sponsors and their agents become more engaged in the review process. And I'll talk about this in a minute, but if I could change one thing about banking right now, I would teach everybody that if you're gonna engage the process by just dropping something in the mail and waiting for a comment, you're losing the battle. You have to follow that thing through, you have to reach out and ask to talk about it. I'll share some examples when we get to those slides, but it's not gonna go well for you if you drop it in the mail and then you tell your client, well, in 90 days, we should hear something. It's just not gonna happen. There's too much work going on, these are too complicated, and it's too easy for people, the squeaky wheel gets the oil. Kind of applies in these cases, because those core project managers are really busy. All right, so some practitioner tips for the prospectus phase. So the prospectus steps should be treated as critical from a schedule standpoint, and the quality of submittal should reflect that in reality. I had up for the draft prospectus, garbage in, garbage out. If you're not gonna do the work to really lay this out and tell your story, describe your project, you're gonna get a big, long comment letter back from the agencies. And and the longer the comment letter is, the longer it takes them to put it together and get it reviewed and get it out. The more unfamiliar they are with your project when you submit a prospectus, the longer it's gonna take. I identified those two elements. The most important components of the prospectus are the need and technical feasibility and the ecological suitability elements. I don't need to say anything more about that. Those are the drivers for the project. They're going to determine your credit yield, and they're the most important for the agencies in terms of evaluating the potential for your project. We used to use the term concept plan for this stage. It was a WACA term that they've since kind of moved over and adopted the federal mitigation rule terms. But prospectus is kind of a meaningless term to me. I don't really know what that means outside of, prospectus, yeah. But concept plan, I think, carries a certain amount of meaning that people that register, they say, okay, we have to get some stuff, a plan down on paper so that they understand kind of what we're thinking of doing. So if you have trouble with prospectus, use concept plan. I think it's a better indicator of what the expectation. If you haven't done one of these, or even if you have, go into Rivets and cyber repositories for some banks. Look at what other people have done. There's tons of them out there. 92 banks were approved since 2014, even more since then. There's some good examples out there. You get a feel for what people are putting together, how they're talking about this, how they're demonstrating that. I do it all the time. I just went in cyber repository and grabbed that letter. Most of the information up through prospectus is in there. So you can look at what other people are doing. The draft instruments are kind of hit and miss whether or not they put them in there publicly, but there's examples to be going in and found. And if searching through hundreds of banks to find a document isn't the thing, just call the Corps, ask, I need an example of one that's good. I want to get better at doing this. Should send me one that you really like so that I can kind of model mine after. Take ownership of the process, be proactive, not reactive. I kind of mentioned this before. If you're, like I said, if you're just dropping things off and you're waiting, you're falling to the back of the line and you're never going to improve the efficiency of the process for your project. You gotta be more involved in that. So for example, and I think I have this in a bullet, one of the things I've tried some of this with varying levels of success. When you drop off a prospectus, call the Corps PM in a couple days. So you put it, they received it because you might get that response back. They received it. You see who's assigned you. Send them an email. Hey, so you got my prospectus. I'd like to take 15 minutes of your time and just brief you on it. And I want to go over and demonstrate to you that I have all the required elements for completeness. And I can just talk to you about the project and what I see are the things that are most challenging with the project and lay out X, Y, and Z. Some Corps PMs take you up on that, some don't. But I think eventually the Corps is going to come around and realize that they're going to benefit from things like that from us on the other side. Because their workload's not getting any less, it's getting more. And they got to figure out a better way to. So if you look at that data that was up there, the Corps has been The mitigation rule's been around since 2008, so we're 15 years into it. The timeframes are bad. So I think they may admit that they need to start looking for ways to get some help on this. And I think the middle ground is to have the proponents of the projects take more of a role in facilitating the review. So think about that. The last one on there, don't be afraid to reach out to the agencies before you submit if you have questions. If there's something you don't know about in your project or you're not sure of, put in a call. Because if it's questionable to you, they're probably gonna choke on it a little bit too. And then you're gonna get a comment back. But I think the goal would be with at least when I'm working with folks, the goal is let's try and reduce the number of comments. So the more we can be sure of what we're putting into a document satisfies the requirements, the better off everyone's gonna be. So I did talk to anyone from the Corps. I didn't call back. I didn't get a call back, but I did talk to some folks at Bowser about, okay, if I've got an audience of people who are interested in wetland banking, what do you want me to tell them? And this is what I got back. There is a point beyond which there is simply too much information on prospectus. So if you have a 300-page prospectus, you cross that line sometime. It's unnecessary to provide that much information. I would say no one's gonna read it, but most people aren't gonna read it. It's too much to send. I would also say that if you're putting that much information in a document, you run the risk of getting a lot of comments back. Because there's more for people to look at, we better put a comment on that, and we're gonna move forward with it, thinking we agree with it. So you'll get it, you could get that. Background historical context is often lacking. So that was one of those elements, remember I said that was critical. That's setting the stage. So to hear it from somebody who's reviewing these, that's often lacking. That means that you're asking for credits or crediting and you don't have the backup. So that historical context is very important if you're going to ask for credits for certain actions that you're going to undertake in the site. So you need to make sure that that information's in. Crediting always seems to be an issue. Read the regulations and guidance and shoot for the goalpost. I kind of laughed at this one because I think there is a certain amount of gamesmanship because you go in there and you're like, well, safely, I could probably give you 50 credits on this. Well, we could put in there that maybe we think we're going to get 60, and if the agencies fight back and we get 55, we can live with that. You can certainly do that. I'm not really an advocate for that. I tend to just be, you know what, make it consistent with the guidance. Make it something that they can look at and say, yeah, this looks reasonable, move on, and not sit there and go back and forth. There's messages popping up on here. You want me to respond? Take advantage of the prospectus. States you get feedback on the design. I think we already talked about that, but certainly include that information. Oh, this is a good comment. Site selection is at the core of a good project and therefore a good prospectus. And I had a discussion with the person who provided this because it came from Bowser. Well, they have the luxury of picking their sites. Whereas a lot of people who are doing banks, you get handed a site. I want to do a bank. And you don't have the ability to really go and find a really good site. Somebody just says, I'm paying you to do a bank on this site. So I've been involved in a few of those where you look at it and you're like, oh man, I gotta have a conversation with this guy. It's gonna be really tough to get the credits he thinks he's gonna get out of this. But to the extent that you can influence that, it's a really good idea to talk about site selection with bank sponsors because a good site will result in good prospectus. It's easy to write up a good site. It's hard to write up a bad site and get good credits and apply some of those actions eligible for credit to the site where you look at it. Not really sure this is a good restoration project. I'm not sure we can get all the hydrology back. There's still going to be a huge ditch running along the side of this. How do we make the case of restoring wetlands all the way up to the edge of the ditch? They're not going to buy it. So those are challenging. So I've hit on a bunch of these. What can you do? What can we do to improve the review process? Make sure they have everything in the submittal for completeness. So try to take the completeness thing away from the agency, particularly the Corps. Make it very clear that it's complete. And don't just, yes, I mentioned ownership. Put the meat on the bone. Give them the LLC information. Tell them how you're gonna deal with it. Make them know that you're aware of some of those issues. So that, it's not just a matter of addressing each one, it's providing the details about each of those elements. Transmit the prospectus with a cover letter that addresses the completeness determination and points the reviewer to each of the required elements. Again, I've had mixed luck with that. It doesn't necessarily result in a whole lot of time savings, but it might. I've even asked a couple of the PMs at the court, I can write sections of the public notice for you if you want me to. They've never taken us up on that, but I have another one in here, to go look at the public notices that are issued and include text in yours. If you have to write up some sort of location description or overall description of your project, write it up so that the court can come in and take it and drop it into a public notice. They love doing that. They won't actually have you write things for them, but they'll copy and paste until there's no tomorrow. See, it's a good way of doing it. Look at other banks I talked about, I see the same one, scheduled meeting with the core, I talked about that. Make sure the core PM is providing all public comments received in response to the public notice in 15 days. A lot of times they'll just attach it to your IDL, which may come 90 days. So you're entitled to those comments after 15 days. And a lot of it, you're gonna get a lot of good feedback on your projects and see where you stand if you ask for those. If they include the agency comments and the public notice comments, they may not do that. But there's nothing wrong with you as a bank sponsor calling on day 15 and saying, hey, we get any public comments in response to the notice? And if so, can you just forward them on to me? Get them right away. There's some core PMs that are real good with that. There's some that just, like I said, wait till that initial evaluation time. But the more insight you can get into how your project is going or doing in the review phase, or things that may have come up, the better off you'll be. And then I had said before, again, try to arrange a meeting with the core TAP IRT after the notice period, while they're working on their comments to answer questions and clarify it. This is a really hard sell, but I think this has the most value for the review process. Is that if you can sit down with them, and instead of them writing a comment, or basically, they will comment on things they don't understand. And it's hard for us as people writing these documents to write everything in a way that's clear to them. So to the extent that you can get some time with them during the review process, where they can say, yeah, your crediting is really off for X, Y, and Z. You say, oh, well, wait a minute, did you look back in the appendix? Because we put this, this, and this in there, and that's what we use for it. Oh, okay, yeah, we didn't look at that. I mean, that's the kind of thing that avoids comments, and it happens all the time. There's a fair number of comments that are put in comment letters on banks that had there been a discussion during the process, there wouldn't have been a comment. So it's difficult because you essentially have to intervene in the review process. And this is where I hope the agencies kind of change their approach and make their process more open and be willing to meet with sponsors before they issue comment letters. I think it would save everyone time. Because you might get into situations where they say, well, you're crediting, and I think even in that example I had up, there was an example of this, that their cultivated field crediting didn't have the justification. Somebody could have stepped in and said, oh, shit, you know what, we missed that air photo. Well, here, we went and did this here. And they can look at it and say, their comment could just be then, your CFC documentation of the prospectus was not complete. You provided additional information during the review period. That needs to be your next submittal. Totally. And you know, for my next one, I gotta include that in there. You can start putting that together. But if you sit around and you have to wait until you get a letter, you lose that opportunity. So again, that's an uphill battle. That was just an example. So I'm done. Are there any questions? Can you just step up and come a little closer so maybe we can pick it up on the mic? Then I just don't have to repeat everything. And you're about as far away as a person can be.
I've seen a lot of projects where there's concern about hydrologic impacts to neighboring properties. Have you ever had success with, I'm just thinking about the bullet point that said, you know, site selection is really key. So yeah, one landowner might want to do a restoration and then there's this issue with hydrologic impacts to the neighbor. Have you ever had any success with like
that willing landowner being able to negotiate with their neighbors, or how do you address that?
I've had success and failures with that. So yeah, it's a big deal because, and Bowser looks at this real carefully because they don't want to accept an easement. It's gonna, for a project, it's gonna have an adverse effect on an adjacent property owner. So these issues will get flagged as mainly as a part of the Bowser review if you're pushing water up. So there are solutions to that. You can get a flowage easement if you talk to your neighbor and you say, hey, I might make your site a little bit wetter, blah, 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 and you kind of figure out what you need to obtain from that. Then yeah, that's a solution. I'm pretty sure that's been done. It's a little tricky because you got another easement process that you're gonna have to do. People sometimes get a little reluctant to do things like that. You can change the boundaries of your project a bit. I know Bowser's done that on a couple of the road banks where there was potential to impact an adjacent property, and they expanded their bank site and acquired that land. There was an easement for that land, and even to the point where Bowser has gone in and to go negotiate with adjacent landowners. The part of it is this bank would be better if we had your land on it, and you can be compensated for it through the purchase of the easement, or potentially you may want some credits. We could carve it out as a bank for you alone, because that the credit is on their property, and in certain cases that was pitched as an option. So there's all kinds of ways to get around it. Or there's all kinds of solutions to it out there. It just requires some negotiation skill and working with landowners. There are times when it doesn't work, but definitely worth discussing it. It's something that if that question's raised, you're gonna have to hit it. You just can't avoid it.
Yeah, I've seen people, go through the various stages and they're still not addressing it, and it fails after a couple years of documents getting shuffled.
It can be a problem for sure. Who else? No online questions?
No.
Stand here for 3 minutes in complete silence. Just because. Sounds right. No, if we don't have any other, yes, go ahead.
Are you seeing similar kind of longer response times in other districts, similar to that data you had for the St. Paul district?
Yeah, you go back to. So that graph that I had up was a subset of the data for all the districts. So like that one. And that just pulled out the districts that have done more than 10 bank approvals. So it's kind of a subset of overall. So you can see, this is the top part of the graph, or the plot there, are the worst performing districts in terms of the time frames. And then it gets better as you go down, but it's the workload up here is more than it is anywhere else. And when I was at the Corps, we used to talk about this, that the federal mitigation rule was like the biggest challenge for the Corps regulatory program, because when that rule was passed, it created this process. I mean, it's 225 days by a rule. That exceeds a lot of individual permit reviews. And when it was passed, there was no additional staffing that was provided to the Corps districts. I mean, some were doing mitigation banking work already, but the workload that the rule created largely came without any additional staff to do it. So in districts with really high banking workloads and also then commensurately high permit workloads, this was a big undertaking. So it's really challenging here. In other districts, some of them deal with it real well. They're very streamlined and they don't take long to process at all. There are other districts, and I'm not going to mention them, that have lower workloads, but their interpretation of the rule and their guidance and requirements are really overbearing. And their process takes longer than what you see in St. Paul. So there's a whole dynamic there that there's certainly the challenge the rule brings to doing this. But the district's way of implementing it also has an effect on this time, significant.
I think I've noticed a little bit of a faster turnaround recently. I think there was the hiring freeze for a while. So they were really low on staff. I don't know if you've noticed faster or not, but I think I have.
Well, I know the St. Paul District too has changed their approach that they are, for the most part, trying to put their regulatory ecologist, I think is the title. I always get it wrong. They're trying to focus those people on managing the bank reviews. So instead of it used to be they spread the workload out across all their project managers. And that was a challenge because you had some people who were better at doing permit reviews that also had a large number of bank reviews. And you had some people who only occasionally did bank reviews that would then get one and they had to ramp back up to the understanding. So what they tried to do is concentrate the review process amongst the regulatory ecologists. So the people who are going to be involved in the banks anyway, and who know the most about the rule, implementation of the rule for the district. So hopefully that speeds things up. That's a lot to ask of those people. Without being too critical, the communication's gotten better with a lot of them. I don't know that it's necessarily resulted in better timeframes. I can't say it either way. I haven't gone back and looked at it. A number of people I've talked to said they haven't seen a change, a dramatic change for the better. It may be no worse. I don't think they're saying, oh, we're meeting all the timeframes in the rule. That would be hard, but the communication is definitely much better. Anyone else? Fantastic. Do we have any other,
No,
Closer.
nothing's coming.
WPA?
No, I don't think so. I mean, thank you very much, Tim. I got a lot out of this personally, so I'm gonna speak for everybody and say they all got a lot out of it too.